Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. We're going to get started. Thank you all for getting here on time, stroke early. I will be berating everyone that turns up later. Hopefully they were just tube problems. So my name is Dan Scarborough, and amongst other things, I'm the publisher of Rockstar Media. And today we are organising two events. We have the Digital Infrastructure Exchange, which is taking place in this hall, and then opposite we have the Web3 Infrastructure Summit. They're both very different events, but they kind of converge in one respect. I don't want to start with the kind of doom and gloom around climate change, etc. But the aim of this event is to tell a bit of a story and take you through a journey that hopefully, if you're a data center operator, you find useful. If you work in the industry, you'll also find useful. We are recording all the sessions as well. We're going to produce a white paper after the event. And we want it to be solution orientated from a content perspective. Thank you to all our panels. We have our first panel session starting now. And this is, I think, designed to kind of set the scene, if you like. So if you're in this industry, you are currently experiencing unprecedented demand. And everyone here, I'm imagining, just to get out of the office today and come to this event was a challenge. And there are multi-megawatt projects going on all over the world, and that demand is not ceasing. If you look at the advent of AI and you look at some of the data points that you get, the numbers are only going to go up, and we're going to cover that during the course of the day from various different panelists. So the question is, we do have an obligation, as all other industries do, to get to zero carbon, and how are we going to do that, and is that realistic given the amount of capacity that we're delivering and the timescales that we're delivering it. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our panelists and we're going to get started. So maybe, if starting with Rob on the left, if you could just do, whilst he's drinking his coffee, if you could just do a quick 1-minute introduction to yourself, and then just then we'll get started with the questions.
Thanks, Dan. Okay, necessary to be quite as close to the microphone. Rob Barth, I founded a business, FoundDigital, around 6 years ago. We're an investment and advisory practice, specializing in cloud internet infrastructures and energy and power infrastructure. And to date, we've advised on circa 15 gigawatts of energy and power infrastructure developments, around 1.2 gigs in terms of IT, and around 20,000 kilometers as it relates to fiber or telco infrastructures. And that's anything from sort of extended metro cross connects at a city level through to transoceanic cable systems.
Perfect. Marientina?
Thanks, Dan. Hello, I'm Marientina Laina. I'm Global Head of Sustainability for NTT Global Data Centers. I'm really pleased to be here with you today. In my role, I look after the implementation of our strategy for our net zero commitment. And it is exactly as you said. Given the expansion that we see globally, the real challenge is decoupling emissions from growth here. And it's not, let's say, a topic that can be tackled by organizations on their own or by industries. It's, let's say, a matter of collaboration of a broader ecosystem as well. So, yeah, it's great to be able to share with you some insights and our experience so far when it comes to our, let's say, challenges we have been facing, but also the way forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Ashley?
Hi, everybody. I'm Ashley Davies. I think I've got the greyest hair on the panel, so that goes with some of the time I've spent in this industry. So I'm presently with Green, and there's no pun in that branding. So Green is a Swiss data center operator and ISP provider. We have 6 different facilities around Zurich, and also we're an ISP in the Swiss market. Background, predominantly through financial services. There's a couple of people in the room I've worked with fondly historically. So I've come to this industry from both sides, actually. I've been a consumer of data centers and typically on the other side of the contract, which was either design, build, but more importantly, operate. And now I work for an operator, so applying that thinking through the service offering and the design considerations that we apply to our sites in Switzerland.
Perfect. Luke?
Yeah, Luke Davies, work for GlobalConnect Data Centers. I run the business. We have 17 data centers across the Nordics. Recently just folded in about 140 kind of smaller POPs and ILAs as well, just to make life more interesting from a sustainability perspective with all of the challenges that come with that. And my business is part of the GlobalConnect group, which is a Nordic fiber and connectivity digital infrastructure entity.
Cool. And Serge?
Well, Serge Conesa, founder of Immersion 4. I'm the troublemaker in the room.
Everyone needs a troublemaker, Serge.
Well, I know. Well, I don't have anything to tell you about data centers. You all know data center and electronic better than anybody. So just one question for all of you guys. If you have a cup of champagne in your hand, you want to cool the champagne, what do? You cool the room or you cool the champagne?
I drink it.
Come on, guys, don't leave me alone. That's a very good point. Well, if you cool the room, it's a data center. If you cool the champagne, it's Immersion 4. We are cooling electronic with liquid.
Okay.
At your service.
Right, so let's get started. So there's a few questions that I'm going to ask, which are going to be followed on from the panel conversations that we're going to be having during the course of the day. I'm going to start with Rob, because he's at that end. And the question I've got for the panelists, we're not going to ask everyone every question, but for Rob specifically, how feasible is it to meet the energy demands of the industry from renewable energy sources, would you say, and what needs to be done to achieve this?
Well, I'd start by suggesting very, because I think if we continue down the vein of location strategy as it is currently and platform architecture at a city level, that's exceedingly difficult. So if we want to say, can we via synthetic accounting principles suggest that we're buying 100% green? Absolutely. If we physically wish to go and interrogate the electrons going into that building, that's a different proposition. So that's the first point. But I do think there are certainly opportunities related to how you transition, and a lot of the ESG statements or the sustainability statements by the large groups would suggest as much. So you move almost from a foundation principle of we have an energy contract, it's a green energy contract, and it's a wrapper. So we look at this universe of this is a generation fleet for this supplier, and we procure based on X amount of generation volume. The next thing is the power purchase agreements piece. And then I'd say almost as a final piece here is I think there is an absolute fundamental imperative for data center owner operators to get involved in energy and power infrastructures. Now you may say that's not necessarily, well, stick to your knitting, but one of the single largest impediments to growth, quite aside from the energy part of this and how green that is the power infrastructures, and we have to pass those two things. They're not the same. The power infrastructures are the transport system. How do we physically connect into the grid or extend the grid to enable connection? And let's just say, as we currently speak, that in my mind and based on our optics is the single largest impediment to growth. And then the secondary thing is, okay, what are we doing as it relates to generation? And in much the same vein as a lot of countries are probably adopting rather curious principles as it relates to what are the building blocks of a generation mix, and they're all sort of banging on the drum of we're going with renewable wind and solar. I say, given the net inherent variability of those sources, what are you doing as it relates to a storage proposition, and specifically long-term storage? Because batteries, forgive me, don't quite cut the mustard. You've got 2 to 4 hours in a commercial context, and if you've got in the UK, 14% load factor on solar. So if it says 100 megawatts on the tin, good for 14 megawatts annual average output. And wind, let's say mid-30s to 40, early 40s for the best offshore proposition at scale. We've got a problem there. There's 8,760 hours in a year, and what are you doing to bridge that gap? And I think that is a big issue. So as we travel from, we account for something over an annual period versus how are you doing matching on an hourly basis? As I said, absence of synthetic accounting, you're not going to get there if you're just looking at wind and solar. And so we might have these very encouraging sort of stats as it relates to we've decarbonized the grid by this amount. But interestingly, I would say a lot of these grids that have gone that route and said, we've gone from 10% to 60% of generation mix decarbonized. Some of those grids have a higher carbon intensity as a consequence of that because all their thermal generating capacity is sitting there in reserve, super inefficient in that context. So I think we've got to have far better resolution on the problem statement, is my view, but I'll maybe pause there.
No, I think that's very, very interesting. Let's move on to Marientina, sorry.
No.
I'm so sorry. So what, in terms of kind of the NTT strategy from a renewable energy perspective, what are you guys doing at the moment? What is your strategy for energy storage and different renewable energy assets?
Yeah, sure. Given our net zero commitment and the fact that power, non-IT, so our scope 2 emissions, but also IT, our clients load, our scope 3 emissions is a big hotspot. So an area that we're really looking at tackling, given the commitment that we have made for our scope 1 and 2 emissions by 2030, a 90% reduction and a 90% reduction across all scopes by 2040. I couldn't agree more with what Rob said in the sense that, sure, we are focusing on procurement, as I said before, right now, given that we are a very global company, there is a very different landscape across our regions. Sure, PPAs and time matching are themes that we are hearing about and trying to tackle when we are here in EMEA, but the situation is quite different, for example, in APAC when it comes to options that are available for renewables. At the same time, so from a procurement perspective, of course, we are very mindful and acutely aware of the different quality of market instruments, so the different shades of green, right? Time matching is something that we are trying to a certain extent to tackle, but at the same time, it is important to know that how do we actually follow a procurement approach that is in line with making progress while at the same time achieving steps for, let's say, taking our game to the next level where the aspect of time matching becomes more and more relevant. That's something that let's say is a challenge for a company like ourselves, given our global operations. There are different opportunities and very different drivers across our regions that we are encompassing in our power procurement. And of course, from our point of view, intermittency, we understand that it is, if we are to meet our commitment, we need to have a strategy about tackling that. And right now, something that we are looking at and trying to understand more and more is the role of on-site storage, for example, and what that would mean. Now, the aspect that was discussed about decarbonizing the grid, yes, we're part of the ecosystem, the collaboration, but at the same time, also, that is why it is really important to understand that no one can really achieve decarbonization on their own. And that is really, let's say, something, let's say, understanding this kind of interdependencies are very, very important so that we are able to move forward together.
Okay. Ashley, you guys are in Switzerland, right? So you're on quite a high percentage of renewable energy. So what's your take on this?
I'm trying to compute in my mind actually the right response here. So Switzerland, by the way, and it's in the title green, but is we benefit from a significant renewable infrastructure. So location is one of the things that I would remind everybody of, which is so on the right side of the supply, we have a energy network which is favourable. But when I say I'm trying to compute the response, if I think in terms of outside of Switzerland, right, and we think about this issue, first of all, I'd say congratulations to everybody in the room because you're here, and I think you're all doing the right thing. And awareness is the most important thing about the situation we're all in with compute. Some of you are responsible for that compute, some of us are not. And so when I think about location, building a facility that's on the right side of a renewable infrastructure, etc. I've got duty of care of the building, I've got duty of care of the mechanical electrical infrastructure, but I haven't got duty of care of the compute infrastructure. And that's where I think there is a bit of a conflict point in our industry. Now, some of you in the room happen to be responsible for that compute infrastructure and therefore are probably doing all the right things about things like utilization, etc. And managing that because I'm sure your CFO or your shareholders are asking you those questions in terms of utilization. But where I have duty of care is around the bricks and mortar and the facility. And I think another important question that we should all ask ourselves in this instance is, what is a data center? And many of the facilities out there, I would suggest, are stranded legacy sites. And I use that language, and that might be considered provocative or controversial, and others might say, we're best in class. Well, I think all recent investments are best in class. But when it comes to what is a data center, what came first? Was it the building? Was it the network? Or was it the compute? And the irony is, I think historically, it came about a building. And actually, the right answer should be a data center. They all come together. It's a building, it's a network, and it's compute. And those three, when you align them and you have like a unified architecture, you can solve for this issue. You can solve for ensuring that you are being best in class in terms of the scope 1, scope 2, and influence those scope 3 characteristics around usage, etc. And I think that an answer in the question that you posed to us originally, which is around how are we going to solve for this, the word taxonomy, I think, is important as well when you're an enterprise user. And the old analogy I used to use and still do, which is if you're on application, you don't necessarily all need a first-class seat on the plane. You probably don't even need a business-class seat. Some of it might be economy. The majority of it is like cargo. And these apps that reside in these locations need to be thought about from a taxonomy perspective and then applied to the landscape or the network infrastructure and or the data center infrastructure. And in that instance, I think you could drive workload to locations that are best in class, that solve for the issues in terms of renewables, etc., versus having a cargo-style application sitting in a metropolis location where you've got no opportunity of solving for, getting towards that PUE of the perfect one, because you're doing everything about the building, etc. So, a long answer to those questions, but I would encourage, and as I said from the outset, congratulations to everybody because we're all doing the right thing, we're aware of it, but actually I think it needs a different set of telemetry as we go forward, and it is about taxonomy and placement of those applications.
I think I couldn't agree more. I mean, I think part of the problem is we don't have control of the entire ecosystem, right? So, and we're all responsible individually for the amount of data that we consume, how much data is increasing. There's no current regulation against data consumption. There's no real understanding of what data is even in data centers. We stop at what's on the door. And I think that part of the regulation question that I think we're going to talk about later on is whether or not data is going to need to be regulated, because we can't continue in these consumption models unless you look at potentially a different form factor. So Luke is one of the reasons why I invited Luke here, other than the fact that he's a thoroughly nice gentleman, is that GlobalConnect as a colo operator, one of the first colos that have embraced immersion cooling. So, Luke, I think it's worthwhile just talking about kind of how you got into it and what your thought process was behind kind of adopting that for customer requirements.
I think, like most things, we got into it for a variety of reasons. And, you know, one of those reasons is that it fits squarely within the ESG agenda that we have as a group. So, you know, we have commitment to the UN Global Compact and science-based targets and, you know, all this kind of stuff. But, you know, this, you know, installing immersive cooling at the scale that we're doing at the moment, which is tiny, in the context of the installed base we have, is not going to make a significant measurable difference to any of those science-based targets. You know, it's more a kind of symbolic contribution at this stage. But I think this then brings me to the second reason for doing it, which is to kind of be on the edge of where the technology is. And for me, this is also partly a kind of human consideration with my workforce. I have a bunch of engineers who really enjoy developing the next wave of technology. This is the next wave of technology. And so it's quite synergistic with the ESG agenda to excite them as well. And, you know, the moment something else comes up, which is also contributing to the broader agenda that we have, you know, I will also invest in that for the simple reason that my guys love, you know, pushing the boundaries. I personally find it exciting on the technology end, but for me, the biggest challenge with this technology is actually getting the customers excited about it and comfortable with it. I think what I'm seeing personally, commercially, is that there is a very small subgroup of customers within my, you know, kind of hunting ground who would be theoretically interested in this at the moment. And some of those customers are kind of uncomfortable for reasons that it is, you know, the paradigm is that we heat the room rather than the champagne at the moment. That's true. And heating the champagne is a very uncomfortable idea to many people who are used to heating the room. And, you know, I have to get people comfortable with that.
So with that, Serge is one of the vendors here that have been working in the space for quite a while. And I think it'd be good, Serge, if you could share what your kind of adoption rate is, the type of customer conversations you've been having, and how you see people kind of moving towards heating the champagne instead of the room.
Well, humans, and I'm one of them, obviously, we are rats of habit. Did you ever try to cool some things, to take calories out of some things with a media which is an insulator instead to be a thermal conductor? Did you ever try? This is what this entire room is all about. We are cooling electronic with air. Air is an insulator, it's not a thermal conductor. So it is already a nonsense from the beginning. That's the elephant in the room. According to Immersion 4, data center sustainability, there is no sustainability using air cooling. Oh my God, I'm making everybody against me here. But in fact, we are all friends for a simple reason. The story of the data center is the story of an electronic component. I promise no more than 1 minute. Imagine this is an electronic component. You take this electronic component, you power it up. Automatically, it generates heat. It generates static electricity. And then in the same time, because it's warming up, it generates humidity, lead to corrosion, oxidation, and electrostatic. You put the same electronic component into the liquid. All those problems are gone. The way we design PCB today is basically all the electronics components with all the conventional coating, and the latest layer is a brominated. Chemical layers. Why do you need all those chemical layers? To protect against air. Because as soon as this electronic component is in the air, it's aggressed by the air. If you put the same electronic
component. How many customers, I think everyone gets the concept of immersive cooling, right? But talk us through the customers that you're speaking to, right? Because you're out there in the market. Talk us about what the response you're getting, what level of adoption you're seeing, what sort of clients you're working with in this. Because at the moment, it doesn't seem real to people that are operating data centers with air, right? So what type of customers what level of requirements are you looking at?
So the customer we have are government, carriers, Fortune 500, those are the kind of the customer we have. The reason why for them is when you look about how to reduce energy consumption on the air-cooled data center, it's a placebo. You can do anything, you can put renewable energy for whatever it's worth, but that's not the point if you don't go to the fundamental and you just address the electronics itself. If you address the electronics, you change the paradigm. The data center becomes a building. Any building can become a data center. You change the way the infrastructures can change. You can basically have the entire electronics to be done in there. And this is why when we look at all the applications from edge to hyperscale, and when you look about any kind of application, even including to mobile operator, well, the biggest problem they have is cooling. It's not so much the electronic itself. And the electronic itself, I would say, consume more and more and more and dispose more, I would say, eat calories.
So we're going to cover this later on during the day, and I know Colm, he's going to talk a bit later on about the development from a chip perspective and how that's reflecting in the rack density and how, you know, what we're designing as the data center industry is going to need to change as this kind of moves through the process. I'm only cutting you off because we haven't got a lot of time.
Please.
And you could talk for 25 hours. So we're going to cover quite a few different things today. We've only got 10 minutes before the last, the start of the next panel, which is going to go into finance that Louise is running for us. I just want to cover the current thoughts on regulations. And I'm going to start again with Rob, because, you know, over the time that you've been in the industry, Rob, and the countries that you're working in, I mean, how real are people taking this challenge? And, you know, what type of penalties, or what is pushing the dial? Is it the feel that they're doing the right thing, or people worried about regulation, or how are you seeing the market shifting over the course of the last couple of years in this direction of towards zero carbon?
Well, I think regulation as it relates to location strategy, and let's say in a European context, can we have one or two large European engine rooms for a cloud operator versus we're addressing this in country and probably even one layer down at a city level or greater metropolitan area. So the regulation that prescribes it must be in country X or Y, I think much like the foundation principles of how some of these groups came across the pond in the first instance, building large engine room, admittedly under a self-perform banner, but I think there's going to be, as a consequence of necessity, i.e., if you can't physically connect something now in a feasible time horizon that allows you to service tactical demand requirements, then you've got to think differently about what you're doing. So I think that imperative is probably going to drive a more European style focus to something that was addressed at a national level. But let's just say, okay, is regulation as it relates to data sovereignty the principal driver behind what's happening? And yes, there's some member states that drive that agenda more so than others. But I think, and even in Ashley's case, it'd be good to get his view of at a canton level versus at a national Swiss level, how that what that variance is. But I think that's the one element. But secondarily, I mean, the regulation specific to data centers, and let's just say to a large degree that's somewhat in its infancy, is starting to bite. I mean, German legislation traveling through at present is mandating heat reuse. We might say a paltry amount at 10%, but it's nevertheless a mandate. You want to switch a data center on beyond X date, you've got to do heat reuse. It's starting to stipulate, okay, your participation in the underwrite of renewable energy assets is now going to be different. For one, you can't procure energy from a generator that is participating in any form of renewably subsidized scheme. So in Germany, they have the EEG Umlage, which is the Renewable Energies Act, and most of those generators get paid 95 euros a megawatt hour, irrespective of whether they put anything onto the grid or not. They pay. That's the strike price, and there's a annual volume allocation against that. So if you're not allowed to procure that as a data center, you now have to go to renewable projects that stand on their own 2 feet. So either you're getting your customer to underwrite that scheme. And they actually quite like this because in many instances, the hyperscalers certainly prescribe it must be additive, i.e. we can't have extant renewable assets that we use for this. You have to be a participant in the development of this. So usually it's in late stage EIA or otherwise, and that underwrite from your customer is fundamental to the success or the build out of these infrastructures. So I think there are a whole myriad of elements that probably will inform this from a regulatory perspective, but I'd say directionally, regulation is going to start to bite and probably disruptively adjust how we're thinking about development, both in terms of what we build, where we build, and when we build it, because there are also time-bounding elements associated with that.
Marientina,
Yeah.
on the carbon, kind of calculating carbon emissions and your
Sure.
net zero commitment, how are you doing that?
Yeah.
As quick as you can.
I
please.
also want to share some thoughts about the role of regulation. So when it comes to the role of regulation and being a driver of action, that is definitely needed. It is in line with what we know from the UN IPCC reports. That is out of question. It needs to actually drive action. What we also see is that this myriad of policy and regulatory requirements, they definitely increase the needs for reporting, which is a good thing, but there is also a difference between reporting and actually action. So that's something that we need to be a bit mindful of because, for example, we see the latest TCFD status update reports that indicates that our companies are reporting climate risk and their financial implications and all of that. Yeah, we see definitely an increase. But at the same time, are they actually using their findings for informing their strategy and taking action? That's something that there is a gap there. There is a delta that we need to actually identify and see how do we use regulation, not as a compliance and reporting exercise, but actually for driving action. So back to your question about greenhouse gas accounting. Of course, it is a journey, I feel, for all organizations. It is a very, it's a complicated exercise. There are different approaches and type of data and access to this data that organizations have. So I think that for us, let's say there are two, in our experience, there are two different buckets of issues that we are tackling when it comes to greenhouse gas accounting. The one aspect is the data collection, so from our own sites, from our own people, but also when it comes to Scope 3 emissions, how do we work with suppliers for getting the most relevant and up-to-date information? But at the same time, how do we make sure that we work closely with our clients as well for information that they might need of us, given that our Scope 3 emissions is a journey that we all need to embark on together. So there is the aspect of data collection and there is the aspect of data quality. So how do we make sure that we move more and more towards refining the data that we use? How
bit later. I just want to ask one quick question, and I'm going to ask just from a kind of customer SLA perspective, and I'm going to ask Ashley, because I think everyone else is going to be involved in some of the other sessions during the day. So one of the challenges that I think the industry's got is that we're dealing with customers' requirements, and there are SLAs that we're under, and those SLAs prohibit operators doing what they potentially could do, or as much as they could do. Do you see any change in the SLAs from customers? Do you see any kind of changes in the onus that they put on you for resiliency so that you can become kind of potentially more sustainable? And is that something you could just answer? And then we're going to move on to the next panel.
So, answer the question. There's more stringent perspective around the legal contracts versus the SLA that we're witnessing. But why is that, by the way? Again, it's because of life cycle. So contracts, I think, typically out of co-location and enterprise were like 1, 3, 5 years. When you're now dealing with hyperscalers, they're not thinking in that short-termism, they're thinking 5, 10 years. And in 10 years, a lot can happen. And I think, and by the way, a quick curveball, the elephant in the room here, it is about life cycle and life cycle mismatch. So when you have a 10-year contract and you have a 10-year SLA, you might be in a building that your generators are already 5 or your UPSs are greater than 5 years old. And frankly, I think the elephant in the room that needs to be solved about, be it regulation or what the case may be, technology refresh is typically less than 1 year. And so, the device you're referring to there is becoming disposable. But when you've put the fabric up to run that device for 10, 15 years, the real challenge is, well, how do you go back and refresh a facility without jeopardizing its use? And in some instances, by the way, those facilities not lending themselves from a construction perspective or distribution perspective for immersive cooling. Finally, regulation, it is the only way. We're in Switzerland. I was with UBS for 7 years, the most onerous regulators around data, and it is going to happen, and it is.